Welcome to Cutting It Straight with Pastor H.B. Charles Jr., author and pastor teacher at Shiloh Church in Jacksonville and Orange Park, Florida. Our prayer is that today's broadcast touches your life. For more resources, go to cutstraight.org. And now, here's Pastor H.B. Charles Jr.
Good day, and thanks for watching the Cutting It Straight broadcast. I'm H.B. Charles, the pastor teacher of the Shiloh Church, and we're glad that you've joined us for this week's broadcast. If you're ever in the Jacksonville area, join us for worship, downtown Jacksonville or Orange Park. But for now, be blessed by the ministry of the Word, and we hope you'll join us again soon. I want to label the message, a message for the mistreated. A message for the mistreated. So let's deal with the obvious up front. We who are African Americans naturally bristle at texts like this. The suffering of our forebears during America's history of chattel slavery makes us uncomfortable, and rightfully so, in any conversation about servants and masters. The matter is worsened by slave theology, in which slaveholders used passages like this to keep slaves in bondage. But we must not allow the difficulty of the text and the misuse of the text to cause us to ignore, minimize, or reject what the Spirit says to the church. 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16 says, all Scripture is breathed out by God and is profitable for teaching, for rebuke, for correction, and for training in righteousness. So up front, let me declare our text is a part of God-breathed Scripture. And there is something profitable that God would say to us out of this text. In our text, Peter, for the first time in this letter, addresses a target group or a subgroup in the readers of the local churches in Asia Minor. In the previous passage, verses 13 through 17, Peter talks about those who were in a high status, emperors and governors. But now in our text, verses 18 through 21, he will speak to those who are in a low status, servants. In the Roman Empire, slavery was status-driven, not race-based. And scholars tell us that up to half of those in the Roman Empire were slaves, representing in total maybe some 60 million people. There were those who were born slaves. Some became slaves as a result of being prisoners of war. Unpaid debt could also lead to forced servitude. And others were sold into slavery by kidnappers. But being a servant in the Roman Empire did not necessarily mean that you were doomed to a miserable life. Like American chattel slavery in the Roman Empire, education of slaves was permitted. And there were many slaves who were more educated than their masters and served in professional roles with servants of their own. And in the Greco-Roman world, slavery was not a permanent status. Through manumission, a slave could purchase his freedom from his master. But none of these perks, quote unquote, changed the nature of their status as servants. No one chose to be a servant. The term Peter uses here for servants is not the typical New Testament term, which refers to a bond servant, one who is forced into service, a slave. He uses a word here that refers to domestics, household slaves. It's meant to describe servants who are in contrast to those who worked in the fields or in the mines. These were servants who served the household of the master. On the surface, that may seem to be a preferable role, but in many instances, it was not. Servants who worked in the fields or worked in the mines did not have to deal directly with the master often. But household servants lived under the thumb, as it were, of their master, whether he was kind or cruel. Peter writes this particular passage to instruct these elect exiles in how to live with unjust masters who mistreat them. In Paul's letters, whenever he brings up this subject, he always gives instructions to both masters and servants. Paul wrote to teach Christians how to treat one another. But that's not the focus of Peter's letter. Peter wrote to teach Christians how to live in a hostile world. The assumption of the text is that these servants were under the authority of unbelieving masters. He does not here give any instruction to the masters, but he focuses on how these servants should treat their masters. It's a rough text on the surface. To be honest, I wish that the New Testament directly rebuked the institution of slavery or directly called for its abolition. It does not. The apostles wrote to new Christians in fledgling churches, and they did not write as social reformers or revolutionaries. They wrote as pastors, teachers. It was not their goal to try to overthrow the cultural systems. They wrote these letters in the New Testament to teach believers how to live for Christ no matter what cultural system they found themselves in. But even though they did not write to overthrow the cultural systems, what they wrote would end up undermining the cultural systems. In a few centuries after Peter wrote this letter, not only was there no longer Roman slavery, there was no longer a Roman Empire. God shut it all down. But in the meantime, Peter writes our text to remind these troubled Christians of a truth that does apply to you and me today. It's the message summary, it's the sermon in the sentence, it's the big idea, it's the thesis statement in one succinct statement. The point Peter makes in this text, I can state in 7 words. Jesus Christ is Lord where you work. May I say that again? Jesus Christ is Lord where you work. You may work in a horrible place, but it is not outside of the scope of the Lord's sovereign authority. Jesus Christ is Lord where you work. So the question of the text is, what does it mean to serve the Lord on the job? Let me walk you through the text. First, would you consider with me the duty of submission? The duty of submission. Verse 18. It teaches 3 lessons about Christian submission. First, there is the exhortation to submission. This is really the theme of this entire middle section of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Verses 13 through 17 applies this principle to authority figures in the government. And now our text, verses 18 through 21, applies this principle to authority figures at work. Verse 18 says, servants, be subject to your masters. The verb be subject means to set under, to place under, to rank under. It was a military term that described an officer who lined up, or rather a soldier that lined up under the authority of his commanding officer. Peter commands the church to submit to those who are in authority over them, not grudgingly, but willingly. And the principle here applies to believers, all believers today, who are under any authority under someone else, children under parents. He'll apply it to marriage in chapter 3. And here, he speaks to those who are in authority under another in the workplace. He reminds us that God is a God of order. And for there to be order, not chaos, someone has to be in charge. It would be wonderful if it didn't have to be that way. But our fallen world and our sinful nature necessitates it. Divine order requires submission to authority. Or if I may say again, in the words of Adrian Rogers, if you are to get over what God has put under you, you got to learn how to get under what God has put over you. And so there is the exhortation to submission. But then I want you to see the essence of submission. Hang in there with me, church. I'm going somewhere with this. Notice the essence of submission. Verse 18 says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect. Respect literally here means fear. It's phobos, where we get our word phobia. And it is translated that way as fear throughout 1 Peter. It means the same thing here. Mark it down. The word respect here, if you're reading from the ESV, refers to fear of God, not fear of man. I want to say that again. It refers to fear of God, not fear of man. And the text says we are to submit with all respect. But notice what he says. Willing submission to others is the result of holy reverence to God. I'm able to submit to others when I learn how to fear the Lord. Submission has nothing to do with the person to whom you submit. It has everything to do with your relationship to God. I don't submit to you because of you. I submit to you because I don't want to get in trouble with my real boss who placed me under your authority. Paul Reed's comments here, when motive is pitched so high that its ultimate quest is approval of God, something happens to the drabbest job or the enduring of the meanest insult that gives it a touch of the sublime. Submission is essential to godliness. If you're jotting notes, you could jot down Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. There, Paul says, bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. Fear and trembling is idiom for reverence for God. With a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service. Ephesians 6:6. That is, don't just work when you know people are watching. And don't work as people pleasers, but as bond servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. There is the exhortation to submission, the essence of submission. But then would you note the extent of submission? I'm still in verse 18. This call to submission is unconditional. It is not selective submission. William Harrell commented here that there are limits to the responsibility of believing slaves to submit obediently to their masters. But this line is drawn not where man would draw it. He's right. Note that verse 18 lists two kinds of masters, and the distinction has nothing to do with the profession of faith. It has everything to do with the character of their conduct. He says, you may be in a situation where you are under the authority of one who is good and gentle. Amen. That's not a hard task, right? It's easy and even enjoyable to work for a boss who treats you right. But note verse 18 ends by saying we're also to be subject to those who are unjust. The Greek word there means to be bent, crooked, or not straight. The Greek word is the word from which we get the medical term scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. Peter says we're to be subject even if the manager is morally crooked. No, we must not obey any command to sin. But what he's saying is the character of the master must not be the excuse to disobey. Now think about that, because you have options that the readers of the text did not have. You can quit and go work somewhere else. You can report illegal, immoral, or unethical behavior. But the principle Peter is saying here is it is not God's will for you to work there and have a rebellious attitude toward those in authority. And so the text begins with the duty of submission. But then what you notice, secondly, the endurance of injustice. When you get the time, go back to Genesis and read the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph is a story of injustice, right? His brothers wronged him. Potiphar's wife wronged him. Pharaoh's cupbearer wronged him. But Genesis does not dwell on the injustice that Joseph had to endure. That long story of Joseph in Genesis is recorded to trace how God was with Joseph in the midst of it all. Can I say that again? The bottom line is not how you are treated. The bottom line is if God is with you. And if God is with you at the end, you'll be able to say, like Joseph, you meant it for evil. Are y'all in here with me today? But God meant it for what? Good. This is how Peter addresses the mistreated Christians in the text. He doesn't linger over the unfairness of their conditions or their circumstances. He encourages them to endure by and through and for the gracious favor of God. And he shows us in verse 19 and 20 the mindset God favors and the behavior God favors. First, he shows us the mindset God favors. Verse 19. For this is a gracious thing. This is commendable. This is praiseworthy before God. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. In this verse now, Peter shifts from the duty of submission and he begins to wrestle with the difficulty of this call to serve unjust masters. In fact, notice verse 16. He uses two terms in verse 16 to describe the effects of working for oppressive masters: sorrow and suffering. Sorrow and suffering. Listen to what he says. You may work at a place where you suffer mistreatment, and it causes you stress and struggle and sadness. But Peter doesn't say escape it. He says endure it. This does not mean that you should be a glutton for punishment. This does not mean you should suffer in silence. This does not mean that you should do nothing about your situation. It means, church, that you should view your job as a place for sanctification, not just a place for a salary. Let me try it again. You should view your workplace as a place of sanctification, not just a place of salary. Could God be using your workplace as a classroom to teach you how to endure? And the text says, if you endure while suffering unjustly, it's a gracious thing. They may talk about you, they may mistreat you, but God's gracious favor will smile on you. But wait a minute, God isn't pleased with grit your teeth, grin and bear it, I'll do it if it kills me submission. He says what is commendable to God, what is a gracious thing, is if you endure, notice the phrase, mindful of God, conscious of God, aware of God's presence with you. People can only see your action. God sees the heart. And the text says, if he sees that you are enduring with a mind on him, it's a gracious thing that wins his favor. Genesis 39, Joseph was sexually harassed by Potiphar's wife. And in Genesis 39, verse 9, Joseph said, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph was able to say no because he was aware that though Potiphar wasn't there, God was. And the text is saying that you got to practice the presence of God in order to experience the favor of God. That's the mindset God favors. But then notice the behavior God favors. 1 Samuel 16:7 says God looks at the heart, but that doesn't mean God ignores our ways. The Lord favors a godly mindset and behavior. And verse 20 challenges us to live in such a way that if we gotta suffer, we endure suffering that is unjustified suffering. There's two ways to endure suffering, he says, verse 20. On one hand, you can endure justified suffering. Notice the rhetorical question at verse 20. For what credit is it when you sin and are beaten for it and endure? And for scholars that try to dress up that ancient slavery was not as bad as modern slavery, Peter acknowledges here in verse 20 that it was just as bad. A master may beat the slave. It could happen because of disobedience or rebellion or pilfering. But he says, if you are punished, this is the principle, if you are punished, if you get in trouble because you did something wrong and you endure punishment for wrongdoing, you don't get no credit with God for that. That's Galatians 6:7. Be not deceived. God is not what? Mocked. For whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. You get no credit if you have to endure punishment because you did wrong. There's nothing praiseworthy about enduring punishment that you deserve. But verse 20 says, but if you do good and suffer for it and endure, it's a gracious thing in the sight of God. Verse 20 here is personifying injustice. It's one thing to do wrong and suffer punishment. It's another thing to do good and suffer punishment. Please note verse 20. Just because you do right doesn't mean things in your life will go right. Again, thanks for watching the broadcast. For more information, a copy of this message, or various resources we offer, you can go to hbcharlesjr.com. We hope you'll join us again for the broadcast soon. Tell a friend. All the best.
Thank you for joining us for today's broadcast of Cutting It Straight with Pastor H.B. Charles Jr. If you would like more resources from Pastor Charles or to support this ministry, he can be reached online at www.hbcharlesjr.com. That's hbcharlesjr.com. Thanks for spending the time with us today, and God bless.